So let's begin this panel on theatre, climate and sustainability. And I think before we begin properly, we really need to make ourselves available to all participants. So I'm just going to introduce everybody very briefly and then reintroduce them in a minute, a little bit more, in a little bit more sustained fashion. So I am Steve Waters. I'm a playwright and also professor of scriptwriting at University of East Anglia. I'm sitting in a room with lots of books at the moment, rather higgledy-piggledy books, and I've got a zip-up jumper and a headset, so I'm going to be chairing this discussion. I'm going to go to the next panellist on my screen, which is Dawn King. Dawn, would you like to just quickly introduce yourself visually?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dawn King and I'm a playwright and screenwriter, and I'm in a white room with some doors and I'm wearing a yellow jumper, so there's a lot of yellow and white going on in my window.
Thank you, Dawn. So going down to Paddy, would you like to just give a little introduction to yourself?
Sure, I'm Paddy Dillion. I'm a theatre architect. I'm chair of the Theatres Trust, but I've also been leading the Theatre Green Book initiative for theatre sustainability. I look surprisingly like Steve Waters. So if you were going to shelve me, you definitely put me on sort of bespectacled middle-aged bloke shelf.
Yeah, you've got to have at least two of those at every session, surely. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm calling in from an office at the Roundhouse where I'm doing the project at the moment.
Thank you, Paddy. Rosie, would you like to just say hi and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a set and costume designer, and I'm in my 30s, and I've got like pale brown skin and black hair. I'm wearing a brown jacket and beige top, and I'm in a park, and there are people sat behind me having coffee, and there are trees behind me. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosie. Rosie's visual image is far more interesting than the rest of us, so I'm feeling a bit upstaged by that. And finally, if I may ask Vanessa to present herself.
Sure. I'm Vanessa Havard-Williams. I'm a lawyer who practices the law of sustainability. I'm sitting at home in a white room with First Nations art and a big photograph of the mountains around Lake Louise in Alberta, which is where I go to be quiet. And I have grey hair, and I am another bespectacled middle-aged person. And I'm in Navy because I'm a lawyer.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Well, listen, let me just lay out what we're going to do for the next hour or so, just so we're all kind of in agreement about this, and just to sort of just frame the discussion a bit with a few provocations that HighTide have shared with us. Obviously, this is an event for HighTide Theatre Company and the Writers Guild. We're delighted that you've all come along to experience this, although of course we're experiencing it ahead of you because we're not going to be streamed to you till a couple of weeks on, I think, from now. So if the world has changed in the next 2 weeks, even more than it changed in the last 2 weeks, we can only apologise for that. So we're talking about some pretty urgent things, which are going to, be very, in a sense, provocative, contested, and really hopefully very interesting. And we've all been pondering three questions that have been pushed our way by HighTide. Firstly, can theatre help tackle the climate emergency? And I think one of the things that I suspect none of us are going to disagree with today is that there is a climate emergency. And until quite recently, there wasn't much theatre, so now it's returning. What is its role relative to that? The second question, which is in a sense an extension of that, is therefore, what are the practical steps that we, as theatre makers, can take or have taken to address climate change or to ensure sustainability in our work? And I think there's two very interesting elements there. Perhaps one is about speaking of it, expressing it, being part of this moment in time as artists. And the other is about the making, the manner in which we create theatre. And I suspect that for some of the panelists, maybe particularly Rosie, Paddy, there will be a really interesting kind of debate about whether we can break down the division between those two things, i.e. content and form, or the process and the product. And the final question, which is a really interesting one, we've all been scratching our heads about, but I think I understand where it's coming from, is there a degree to which thinking about climate conscious theatre, or indeed climate conscious politics, is it inherently elitist? Can it be something that can tend towards a type of elitist middle class kind of cultural and political moment. I hope that it isn't, but I think it's a really interesting thing to ask when that's often the way it's portrayed, actually, seen as the concern of middle-class lefties, etc. So before I head over, what I'm going to do is ask a panelist to talk for a few minutes about those questions and just reflect on those questions, and then we're going to talk a bit to each other, and I'm going to try and make sure that doesn't sound too confusing, because we know how Zoom can get quite confusing at times. So there'll be a lot of inviting people to speak and then hearing their thoughts. I'm just going to briefly say why I think I'm here. I'm here because I'm a playwright. I did write 2 plays, which were often described as one, called The Contingency Plan, way back in 2008, 2009, which ran at the Bush Theatre, and they were about climate change. And it's quite interesting to reflect about how difficult that seemed to be to do back then, and how unprecedented it might have felt to audiences back then. How 10 years on, 11, 10, 12 years on, we are in a completely different reality, it seems to me. And I'm not saying that there isn't still resistance to this notion of climate crisis. There obviously is, but it seems to me the majority of what's going on now is about not if, but how, if you like. What do we do now? Because the other thing that's changed in the last decade, it seems to me, is that climate change was often projected forward as a reality to deal with, 2050, 2100, sometime down the road. Now it's literally tearing the world up in real time. I mean, the last summer has clearly been really quite terrifying, with the heat domes in the Pacific Northwest and wildfires in the Mediterranean. And we've just had the latest dispatch from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as Antonio Guterres just said, it basically is code red for humanity, that this is, the scientists have stopped being cautious and persuasive, and they're starting to shout. And also, we're obviously we're about to have a really major event in this country, COP26, up in Glasgow, world's leaders, not including, I think, Scott Morrison from Australia, sadly, but maybe he will come, are meant to be converging in Glasgow under the tenure of Boris Johnson, God help us, to discuss some of these questions and to kind of frame the next step in terms of our action. So we actually have an extraordinary platform right now for some of these questions. So let's start our conversation, and I think I'd like, if it's okay with the panelists, to reintroduce them, not just visually, but this time in terms of their work and their contribution to this panel, because it's an incredibly interesting panel, I think. And I'm going to start with Dawn, because Dawn obviously is a playwright, a fellow playwright, and an extraordinarily powerful playwright. Her first play, Foxfinder, won the Papatango Award and has ended up in the West End, and was an extraordinarily interesting, surprising, yes, dystopian play, but on the other hand, quite sort of a play inflected with echoes of the past, whether it's Arthur Miller or, there's a sense of past and present converging in that play, and a rare interest in the natural world in theatre, putting kind of right at the centre, at the heart of the story, things which have often been excluded really from storytelling, things which actually, I'm trying to kind of myself grapple with. How do we, reframe human experience? And Dawn has worked a lot in this sector. She's working a lot with Katie Mitchell, for instance, obviously one of our leading climate artists, if you might argue, although it's also quite intriguing how much of that work's happening, as with Dawn, in Germany, as opposed to the United Kingdom. And it would be great to hear about your new version of The Cherry Orchard, The Trees, Dawn, that you're collaborating with Katie on. So a lot of work that Dawn's doing that is incredibly salient to this, but what's also notable is it's so diverse, it's so fascinating and rich in form and practice, and doesn't in any way correspond to a slightly cliched idea of what climate change art might look like. We've also got Paddy Dillion with us. Paddy has already introduced himself. He is, I suppose, primarily an architect, right? Paddy, it would be the way you might define yourself, and an architect within theatre. But as so Shuba's already said, well, actually, has he said? No, I'm going to say it because Shuba hasn't shared this session. Take that bit out, Aaron. Paddy has particularly been responsible for an extraordinary endeavour, the so-called Green Books, which are an attempt to collate, if you like, a very accessible and go-to series of best practice accounts of how British theatre can build sustainability into its practice. I think volume 1 has come out, which is about production, questions around production, and volumes 2 and 3 are appearing in short order, and we'll hear more from Paddy about that in a minute. Very much linked to that is Rosie Elnile's sort of work. Rosie's a designer, and I think it's fair to say, from what I've read about your work, Rosie, that you're very much there to challenge the role of the designer in the theatre, and indeed the role of design in theatre, perhaps the role of the visual arts per se. Wonderful ideas about thinking about productions in the context of the theatre building in the context of the environment in which it finds itself. Some of your work recently, including the show Prayer, which I'm very keen to see, is actually about bringing nature into the theatre, actually planting a garden into the Gate Theatre, which is an extraordinarily exciting idea. So really, clearly theatre is a material medium, and design is the place perhaps where that's most clearly expressed. And the carbon footprint of theatre is obviously manifest in what we used to call consumables in theatre, the food that gets eaten on stage, the costumes that get worn and washed every night, and then of course the lights that kind of are driven by what kind of energy. Theatre is not innocent of carbon emissions, and so that question of how that can be changed without merely being a reduction of theatre's scope, I guess, is one of the things, Rosie, you've been exploring. And then we've got the fantastic privilege of having somebody from a completely different section altogether, Vanessa Williams, who comes to us from Linklaters, one of the largest law firms in the world, I guess, and is global head of sustainability and climate policy there. So she's going to help us think a little bit about best practice from outside of the sector of industry. Right, enough of me and enough of introductions. I'm going to sort of invite Dawn up to the podium first, if you like, the virtual podium. Dawn, just share a few thoughts in response to those questions, or indeed any thoughts that you think are relevant to this discussion. And I'll just mute myself for the time being.
Thanks for that amazing introduction. It was very flattering. So I was thinking about the first question, can theatre exist to help tackle the climate emergency? And I think one question that kind of comes to my mind, even though Schubert asked us to kind of maybe, think about hope and positivity. I think some people might say, what's the point of making theatre about the climate emergency? Like, what is the point? Like, we can't really do anything. And I think that, like anything, there's always a point in acting. There's always a point in trying. Like even if I don't think that the cause is lost. I don't think it's hopeless. I think, we should always kind of try and, look for the hope and the positivity for sure. So having said that very quickly, I think that for me, there's the answer is yes, definitely. And I think there's two things. There's the kinds of stories or shows that we're making. There's the content of those shows, and then there's how the shows are being made. And I think, as a writer, one can obviously have input into both of those things. So, you can make a show that is about the climate emergency, but if you make that show in a kind of non-sustainable way, then is that positive or is that negative? If you make a show where the story's got nothing really to do with climate emergency, but you make it in this incredibly sustainable way and you kind of explore these new methods of doing it, is that kind of better? Or so there's two different ways to kind of to think about it, I guess. And I suppose that sort of like thinking about the role of the writer, I suppose. Like, I think that one thing that writers do is, you kind of absorb things that are going on in society, and then you try to kind of like say some truth about it. And I think as a kind of truth sayer in the kind of global village, it's kind of our job to say, hey, this thing, it's look at this thing, and like, I'm not saying that I have answers, but at the very least be sort of pointing to it or asking questions about it or something. And I think that also kind of relates to, maybe this is moving a bit into kind of step two. It's like, practically speaking, the things that we can do, it's like, you're making a piece of work and you can maybe ask difficult questions of the theatre or of your collaborators, like, how are we making it? What's the sustainability practice? Like, how are people traveling? All of these different things. Like I have kind of asked some of those questions. So I've got a show which I wrote for a theatre in Germany called The Trials, which is going into rehearsal in 2 weeks, and it's about a future in which young people are putting the older generation on trial for climate crimes and deciding if they're guilty or not. and it's a panel of teenagers, like 12 to 17-year-olds, and we're casting it non-professionally. And I'm defendant 2, and a future version of me, I'm defendant 2, and I kind of give a statement about why I'm not guilty. And the kids just like laugh at me, and they call me a dinosaur, and they say, just because you pollute for art doesn't mean it's not pollution. And why does she keep talking about the awards that she's won? We don't care. She's a dinosaur. She's a polluter. And I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end. You're going to have to come to Germany and watch it. But anyway, I'm taking the train over there to go to rehearsal. It sounds like a very minor thing, but I'm taking the train. And I made the point of saying, I'm going to take the train. And the theatre said, okay, that's fine. And I'm hoping that play will have a production here. I'm hoping it's going to have a production here next year. It's supposed to have a production here next year. And I also have another show that I'm working on with Katie Mitchell called The Trees, which is like a kind of quite a different thing. And that's also in Germany. And with that show, we're kind of trying to put like non-human stories on stage. So it's kind of really about the trees. And we're thinking about the notion of eco-dramaturgy, and what does it mean to kind of like tell the story of the cherry orchard, but not really tell much of the human story. And with both of those shows, we've been thinking about how the shows are being made, and what's happening in the building and all of that stuff. But one of the things that I've done, just to kind of feels like quite a small thing that I've done with my work, but not just those 2 projects, but with other projects that I've been working on, is I put a diversity and sustainability statement in the front of my scripts. So in the front of my scripts, it says, please produce this play in the most sustainable and diverse way possible, or something like that. I'll find the wording and I'll put it in the chat, so that means that anybody working on it can point to it and say, look, the writer said this, and so that means for the show in Germany, we're not making any new things for the set. We're using all things that are already in the theatre, that already exist. So I feel like I've said a lot. I feel like I've been talking for ages. But thinking about question 3, I was thinking about, is climate conscious theatre an elitist structure in the industry? And I don't know about that, but I think one thing that climate conscious theatre maybe asks you to do is to think about making theatre with less, but in a kind of imaginative and exciting way. And I think that in theatre, that's kind of what we're used to doing. So I think that maybe there's a different way of looking at that question, which is like, it doesn't have to be like an elitist thing. It could be something that even companies or people with not very many resources could find an exciting challenge. So yeah. Okay, so I've said loads. So
you've said absolutely brilliant things, and I think, particularly if we think of our potential audience, you guys out there in the future, being possibly writers themselves, or certainly freelancers, perhaps. I think one of the things that's very encouraging about what you just said, Dawn, is there's a slight feeling sometimes that we are beholden to existing structures. We as writers, we just create our work, and then somebody else takes responsibility of how it's done. So that notion that you might encode that into the work, into the DNA of the work, is really, really exciting. And obviously, I love the sound of the trials. So you're literally going to be on stage as the person being interrogated?
No, because it's in the future, so it's going to be like an older person playing me. Maybe Emma Thompson, just putting it out there.
She would be perfect, actually. Yeah, get Emma Thompson to do it. But in a way, you're actually finding, as you say, a dramaturgy which is, regardless of its content, pushing in a really interesting transformative direction. So on that idea of being beholden, or if you like institutional practice, maybe we should turn to Paddy, because Paddy, you've done probably more than most to try and accelerate those questions, because after all, I remember when the contingency plan was on, the Bush raised its game there and then. It had to. How could you put a play like this on without doing anything differently? And I suppose what's driven that process for you, Paddy, and tell us a little bit about your feelings about these questions that we've been discussing.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And I think I sort of can't help starting with a kind of provocation to a provocation, which comes in a way out of suddenly discovering that I am indeed middle-aged, even though I never planned to be, which is that I first went on training about sustainability and the climate crisis as an architect in the very early 1990s. That's 30 years ago, and we knew all about it then. We knew the physics, we had the stats, we knew what was driving climate change, and we knew exactly what was going to happen, and in the subsequent 30 years, it has happened. And that makes me think that any conversation now, which is around kind of, should we be doing something about this, just makes me think, come on, you know, wake up, honestly, let's get beyond that and start doing something about it. And that was very much what was driving the process that started us working on the Theatre Green Book. And how that was that I was getting, because I also chair the ABTT's theatre conference, which happens every 4 years. I was getting lots of theatre makers together, freelancers of different kind, producers, designers, writers, architects like me, and so on, for a couple of meetings, just to try and sort of understand what the conversations in theatre were about. And sustainability was always there. You know, none of us needs to be told there's a climate emergency. We know that. But what everybody was saying was expressing a kind of frustration about, what do I do about it? And somebody at one point said, you know, very tellingly said, it feels like we're all waiting for something to be invented. And meanwhile, I was talking to sustainability engineers that I knew, people in the sort of climate world that I knew, who were saying, you know, there isn't an invention. This is not rocket science. It's about using less stuff. You know, it's actually not complicated. So we started digging into it, and we just, I think, realized overwhelmingly that we need to stop sort of trying to pick apart the question and start coming up with answers, even if they're imperfect answers. We just have to get this enormous stone over which moss was growing turning. And if the first answer we come up with needs to be perfected, then we'll perfect it. But we need to work out what the blockage is so that we can start working in more sustainable ways. And I was talking to production managers, to designers groups and so on, who've been, you know, are passionate about this, have been talking about it for 10, 15, 20 years. And we found, I think, where the primary blockage was, which is that theatre is so complex, it's so bespoke, it involves so many different people, from writers through producers down to set builders, wigs, hair and makeup and so on, that no one person can create change by themselves. You know, a passionate designer will not be able to create a sustainable show if the director isn't interested, if the producer hasn't allowed a budget for it, if the set builder is still buying plywood from Indonesia. Everybody has to understand what everybody else does and know what they need to do differently so that they can practice differently. We're all tied together in theatre. And that was the start of the Theatre Green Book. And as I think you said, Steve, we divided the challenge into 3 sections. We've got to make productions more sustainable. We've got to make our theatre buildings more sustainable. We've got to make theatre operations, front of house, all that stuff sustainable. Then we can say that theatre is working sustainably. And we, you know, and the ingredients for putting this guidance together, which has got to be practical, it's got to be immediate, you've got to be able to do it now. It can't rely on gathering lots of data for carbon calculators, because frankly, who has time to do that? And it needed to come from theatre. So we drew together theatre makers of all kinds to generate the guidance and the standards with their expertise. But it also had to be based on real understanding of where the impact lies, which is why we got fantastic sustainability experts called Bura Happold involved to underpin it. Because what we are not interested in, what the planet is not interested in, is recycled coffee cups. You know, God bless you, use recycled coffee cups, but that's not the impact of theatre. The impact of theatre overwhelmingly, I'm talking about productions now, because of course buildings have their own impact, is the cycle of using virgin materials, plywood that's come from East Asia, raw steel made with an unbelievable carbon debt, putting it on stages and then throwing it in a skip afterwards. You know, that's insane. And of course it's stopping, and there are many theatres that have been working on this for ages. But we need to move to a circular economy where we're reusing and recycling more, which is why, you know, Dawn, the sort of project you're talking about are so fantastic, and they're such great examples. And that's what we built the guidance around. It's meaningful change, not just change that makes us all feel a bit better. And people are using it now there. All the national theatre shows are being made to Green Book standards. Dozens and dozens of small companies and touring companies are trialling it. And it will keep changing as theatre makers' expertise keep feeding into it. And meanwhile, as you say, the other 2 volumes are coming out. What I was expecting at the start was to have a lot of people saying kind of question one, you know, does theatre really matter? You know, surely we're tiny, surely it's not really a problem. The really interesting, the really kind of thing that makes me feel very optimistic is among the sort of probably 300 or 400 theatre makers that I've spoken to as part of this process, that's come up once, only ever came up once. And I think there's two reasons for that. And the first is that, of course, you know, you could take the word theatre out of that question and put UK in. You know, can the UK really solve the climate crisis? Look at China, look at America. So it's a scalable argument. And we're now in a place, because we all know what emergency means, where we all have to do everything, firstly. And I think secondly, perhaps more importantly even, and this is for me because I don't make theatre, I'm a theatre punter, I'm audience here. And I, having been, you know, going to theatre all my life, loving theatre, I can't imagine humanity facing the biggest crisis it's ever faced without theatre being part of the answer, without theatre being the focus through which we look at our fears, look at our solutions, work out how we collaborate, try to understand what's going on. Theatre has to be part of this conversation, otherwise it's meaningless as an art form. And if it is part of that conversation, then it has to be sustainable itself, otherwise we're hypocrites. And so that's a primary reason why we have to make theatre sustainably if theatre is going to be part of the conversation, in which of course it can help. Then, and indeed in which it has to take part if it's going to be relevant. The practical steps, I mean, the Theatre Green Book, and I'll put it in the chat if that gets through to everyone later if you haven't come across it, is attempting to provide exactly those practical steps, whatever scale you're working at, small scale, opera, musicals, tiny one-person touring shows. They can all be made sustainably. The thing that keeps me absolutely, there are two things that make me really optimistic, three things, wow, that make me really optimistic about this. Partly the speed of buy-in from UK theatres. Fourth thing, the speed of buy-in from UK theatres. The speed of interest and attention from global theatre. I was on a call yesterday with theatre makers from the United States and Canada, we've been talking to for ages, Denmark, the Philippines, Australia. I've had other conversations with East Asian theatre makers. This really is a global thing. The fact that all theatre makers have made sustainable shows. Everybody at the start of their careers was doing really, really sustainable work because you had no money, you know, and so you couldn't build sets and you couldn't afford plywood. So everybody knows how to do it. The expertise within the industry, which has just poured down onto us at the Green Book, and we put it all into our toolkits online, is there. And what we're proving now through the shows we're trialing is that yes, you can also make large, visually complex shows. The NT's doing it at the moment in a sustainable way, where, you know, and our baseline standard in the Green Book is that half the materials on stage need to come from reused and recycled sources, and 65% need to go back to reused and recycled sources. And as you step up to advanced level shows, you end up in a zero carbon world. That's the journey we all need to go on. I've been rambling too long. So
No, Paddy, that's for that. And thank you for your work, by the way. I mean, what you're doing.
Well, it's not just a thing at all.
Well, it's just utterly foundational, isn't it? And I think one of the things, in a way, Dawn touched on it as well. I mean, theatre is a resourceful, hopeful medium. And I love that. In a way, perhaps the key phrase is Jerzy Grotowski's great book, Towards a Poor Theatre. Maybe that is the direction of travel to kind of create towards a sustainable theatre. But also that notion that theatre is a microcosm, right? So if you can change theatre, you can probably change a lot of other things fast. So that's very exciting and hopeful to hear. Rosie, in a way, this goes beautifully over to you in your practice because, you know, in some respects, the designer is one of the key figures in this conversation, perhaps the key figure in some respects, and have somebody who was such a kind of alert relationship to her craft is going to be great. So could you offer some of your thoughts in relation to what we've heard?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that, Paddy. I mean, what I guess I felt I was really struck by in what you were saying was the idea of putting things onto their feet fast. And one of the things that I think is very powerful about theatre that is almost like theatre's kind of superpower in a way, I think, is like process and rehearsal. And the fact that we're kind of constantly in this space of negotiation and reimagination and rehearsal. And that as like a kind of tool, I suppose, to respond to something which does need to be, where things do need to be remodeled and retested and reimagined, is really exciting. And I suppose it's those structures outside of the rehearsal process that maybe we need to re-examine. And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is how we think that design and materials create meaning. And I think that that's about finding new ways of, I think, writers and designers and programming, really, that collaboration happening early. So the fact that, I suppose, traditionally the way that design has created meaning has been very representational. It's been about describing a place, or whereas in, say, visual art, in kind of installation or fine art, there's a much richer understanding that materials generate meaning. And so I think, like, a good example I kind of think of is that you're making a kind of show about feminism and you're using T-shirts that are made by women in poverty wages in the global south. That to me has a great meaning, but is a kind of meaning that's not shared with an audience. So I think that that's a really important part of my thinking and my practice about design and sustainability and a kind of global systems of production, I suppose, because I think one of the things that's really important to me, or how I became interested in sustainability as a practice, is the kind of interlinked ways in which different injustices are connected. And I think it's really important to work sustainably within theatre, but I also think it's really important to understand that it's a crisis of capitalism, it's a crisis of capital and of business, enormous businesses. And to me, it's as much about kind of like questioning and challenging those power structures in the way that we make and work, as it is with using sustainable materials. Both things kind of have to be dually important, I think. So the project that you were talking about, Steve, Prayer, which was about planting a garden, wasn't so much about the actual the fact that planting a garden within the gate would be sustainable, which I'm actually not sure that it would, but it was more about how that like process and practice would ask us to rethink our relationship with the theatre space, with the materials we're using, and how those materials kind of generate meaning within a space. Can theatre help tackle the climate emergency? I guess I'm saying like yes, but I think it's mainly maybe our biggest power is like processes and how we talk to power. And I feel like, Paddy, you're like so brilliant in thinking about these practical steps, but I do think one of the things that I'm interested in is how designers can help to remodel processes within buildings. So rather than coming in at the end of a process, when a production process has already been decided, helping theatres to imagine new processes, which kind of centre reuse, reclamation, maybe like working with local people, local kind of like, I don't know, kind of like imagining how that process and that form can be. Oh, sorry, Paddy.
Did you want to respond to that, Paddy?
I didn't want to interrupt you. Please keep going, but I did want to come back once you finish.
Let's just log that. You keep going, Rosie, and we'll give Paddy a chance to respond.
Yeah. So how we can reimagine those processes, I suppose, and maybe a focus on outcomes, a focus on process rather than outcome, and kind of see what, because I also feel that we have to kind of acknowledge as designers, as makers, that theatre can't look the same as it does, and that's fine. And I think that that's really exciting, and I actually feel that there was a kind of paradigm shift in the way that theatre looked maybe like 15 years ago or something like that, where design became this much more important thing, kind of influenced by subsidized theatre in Europe. And I think there's been a kind of like desire to like replicate those kind of aesthetics in UK theatre, but I actually think there's a whole new paradigm shift which kind of needs to happen and is super exciting, which is about how we create sustainably and ethically in everything we do, and allowing aesthetics to emerge from that, which I think is deeply connected to the final question, which is kind of around elitism. And I think lots of the ways that smaller institutions or community projects that are involved in theatre, the way that they create design is incredibly sustainable. And I think one of the most exciting things that I can imagine is how we can take those sorts of practices, which actually are often like more embedded in kind of community, more embedded in kind of like local, theatres that work in kind of more local ways, and kind of scaling those up to the scale of the National Theatre, to the scale of the Royal Court or whatever, and allowing, I guess, new aesthetic values to kind of emerge within our practice, which also, I guess, to me includes like, how do we think of and how do we use the infrastructure of the theatre as a material, as a sustainable material, that to me also, I guess, connects to how we think about this kind of spatial politics of the theatre. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Rosie. Paddy, do you mind if I hold you for a second, because I think we should get Vanessa into the conversation, and please just log your thoughts, because we obviously want to hear about that. Rosie, that's really fantastic, and I think that idea of keeping process in view, and also the way in which we have been sort of locked into models, haven't we, in British theatre? You know, how many weeks are allocated for rehearsal? When does the designer intervene in rehearsal? You know, just very simple things like that, which lock us into problematic practices, perhaps, that we can reflect on. Vanessa, how does the view, what is this conversation, how does it sort of strike you as somebody working in a very different sector? Although obviously, you know, theatre does not operate outside the law. You know, we're all subject to that, just like we're all subject to the climate crisis. And I just wondered if you could, you know, sort of offer us a view from the outside, which, you know, draws upon your own experience and your own practice in the world of law.
So thank you. It's very interesting listening to you all and seeing the thread that flows through the different activities that you each perform within theatre. And my job is really to advise on the law, the old law and the new law that is coming, and some of the commercial drivers that are reframing business and reframing the financial markets and bringing in things that were externalities that did not have a financial value attached to them, though of course they did have a value. That's bringing those in and starting to have to rewire itself. And if I take us back to the IPCC report, which is a very stark report and really a very clear indication that the signal is coming through strongly. It's not, you know, it's no longer just noise, it's a very clear signal. I'm going to pick up Paddy. Paddy was talking about the planet, and I'm going to go back to the fact that this isn't actually an issue for the planet. The planet will carry on quite well. This is an issue for us. This is an issue as to the survival of our species and lots of other species. And I'm also going to take you to Edmund Burke, who basically said that you allow evil to happen when good people do nothing. And an election not to decide or not to have a plan is effectively a decision not to act. And one of the things one of the interesting bits that we are in the middle of is that regulators and central banks, investors and companies are all starting to engage with this as a challenging issue. We are still waiting in this dance that we're doing on governments because of some of the difficulties that governments have with the electoral cycle and with arguing for quite significant change and effectively another industrial revolution. And that's particularly difficult in democracies. So what some of the banks are going through at the moment and what companies will increasingly look at is their exposure to three different scenarios. One is orderly transition, and that's the loveliest, and it is possible. The next one is disorderly transition, which may be the most likely. And the third one is hothouse world, and that's bad for all of us. And they're also thinking, the really wise, considered ones, how will we be judged in hindsight? Which is why I was so interested in what Dawn was saying. So business is thinking about all of this. But when we communicate with them, often people who get it find it overwhelming, terrifying, and exciting. And all of those seem to me to be valid reactions. But some people struggle to get it. And often that's because of the complexity and the fact that no single person can effect change, which is what Paddy was saying. We're looking at this massive, gnarly problem, and it's all about systems, whether it's within theatre or whether it's in different sectors. And we have to unpick that, and we have to unpick it and come to a different way of doing things at speed. So the way in which we engage is really to make it real for people. So that's a lot of what my communication is. And in the city, that's telling people stories about what happens when things go wrong, but it's also building out the opportunity, because you really need optimism within this, and realistic optimism is perfectly possible. We do have to get a wriggle on, but if we get a wriggle on, it is achievable to do what we need to do within the timeframes that we've got without huge damage. There will be some damage. So it seems to me, going to your questions, absolutely the theatre can exist, should exist to help tackle this agenda, just like everybody else should be doing. And that there are practical steps, both in terms of the creation of new works and in how that flows through the whole ecosystem of theatre. And yes, it can be viewed as an elitist structure, but that's probably if we're doing it wrong. What we badly need at the moment is a way to engage, to make it real for people and to make it capable of solution. And that seems to me to be a role where you are beautifully placed, much better than many of the rest of us are placed, to effect that, a piece of that communication, particularly while others are being slightly slow.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was absolutely fascinating. And I love the notion of the new law. It's almost like the new Old Testament, the New Testament, isn't it? We're kind of, at this point of paradigm shift, and those three, that sort of idea of orderly transition, disorderly transition, it feels to me like we're in disorderly transition, aren't we? I mean, when you demarcate those moments, is going to be really, really interesting. And hothouse world, obviously, we all seek to avoid. So let's go to Paddy, because Paddy, you had something that was hanging over the conversation that we'd love to hear from you. And then, I just think, I think we'll have to do hands up, I'm afraid, so to stop it being disorderly Zoom conversation. But I have no fear that we haven't got loads to say to each other. And if we fall silent, I'll just say something. So Paddy, what was your response? I think you were going to come in and say something to Rosie.
I was going to come in, Rosie, sorry for stopping you in your flow. But you said two things that were so true and so important that I really wanted to double underline them. And one is that it's about process. And if you don't, it's so true that if you don't change the process, you're not going to be able to make more sustainable work. You have to look at the relationships between everybody in the chain that's making a production if you want to have a different outcome. And that means far more equitable and collaborative work between people. It means involving designers and others much earlier in the process and giving them more space and time if you want sustainable solutions, and of course paying for that space and time as well. It means breaking down some of the hierarchies in theatre. You can't be in a world where one person says it must be like this, whether it's sustainable or not. You have to have a much more equitable and collaborative approach to making the work together, drawing on everybody's expertise. And of course, that means that, that shows will take longer to produce. So I think it's so true what you were saying, that if you just try and feed the desire for sustainability into the processes and relationships we have now, you will, surprise, surprise, end up with exactly the same shows we had before. And so that's exactly what needs to be changed. And in the Green Book, we go into that a lot. And I think the other thing which is incredibly important is not being scared of change. You know, if we try to make the same shows we made 10 years ago in a sustainable way, then, you know, of course we're going to be in sort of austerity theatre. They'll just look shabby. And so it needs creativity. It needs change, but creativity and change are what theatre thrives on. So I'm, you know, again, as an audience member, I'm really excited by what the next phase of theatre is going to be like. And going back, Steve, to something you said earlier, and then I'll close, about the strength of this sector. And one of the fantastic things that one of the sustainability experts said when we were working on the Green Book is, it's so great working with a sector that believes in change. You know, trying to change the automobile sector, you know, that's hard, wow. But trying to change theatre when theatre believes in change anyway and is full of creative and dynamic people whose whole way of working and way of thinking involves continual reimagining of things that didn't exist before. Of course it can happen. Of course we can do it.
Thank you, Paddy. That's so inspiring, isn't it? And I just want to, well, Rosie's got a point here, and I also wanted to just invoke Dawn, something Dawn said earlier on about telling the truth as a sort of foundational principle here. And it reminds me a little bit of the so-called climate realist kind of mode of thinking, that actually simply, you know, that in itself is a bombshell at the moment. And something to Vanessa, you've been trying to sort of share those stories to change practice. Rosie, what's your response to that, what Paddy just said?
Oh, well, it was actually more of a response to Vanessa, to be honest. But I guess one of the things that I can imagine a system of kind of sustainable theatre making, or that to me seems within my, I can imagine that basically, because that's the way, yeah, it makes sense to me. I guess what I feel when I start to feel quite unoptimistic and despairing is when I guess I feel like I don't necessarily understand where to put energy in terms of like communication with audiences, or because it seems to me that there's the danger within theatre of imagining this kind of like personal responsibility. Like if I can change the mind of one audience member, if I can show that working sustainably to one person, that's kind of enough. And I feel like that's often the way that we talk about our work in theatre, but actually that's not the case within this crisis that we're in. And it's like, is it connected to the way that people vote, or is it I guess it seems to me that I guess I just feel a little bit overwhelmed in that capacity. Does that make, and I'm not asking you to answer my question, it's just a kind of discussion, I suppose.
Well, in a way,
because people need sustainable coffee cups. No.
And I suppose it's that notion, which is part of your work, Vanessa, of trying to advocate and change practice. You seem reasonably optimistic about the outcomes there, but to move the huge forces in society around seems really quite, you know, I share Rosie's sort of pessimism, actually. It reminds me of the old adage from Frederick Jameson, you know, it's more easy to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And, you know, that kind of, it's very difficult to sort of imagine how you can transform, say, the international finance system rapidly and in a thoroughgoing way. And but I detect from you that some optimism with some of those conversations. I don't know what you feel about that.
So, I think you have to maintain optimism and realism and sort of move between the two. So we are asking ourselves to do something that is an absolutely enormous challenge, and we've faffed about for 20 years, and that has made it a bigger challenge. However, it is possible, and if within our each ploughing our furrow, we can manage to effect change, the aggregate action becomes quite significant. The area of greatest concern to me at the moment is how how we engage with everybody in relation to climate change in a way that isn't apocalyptic, because actually going down that route is the flip of the last 20 years where there's been challenge to the science. You can then flip and say, oh well, it's all too hard to do anything, so let's party while we can. Both of those seem to me to be wrong, but it does require a huge amount of oomph right across society, and for that we need to engage more people than are currently engaged. So I maintain my optimism. What else is there to do?
And well, I think on that note, I mean, we should go over to Dawn again. We hadn't heard from for a while, because in a sense, how you raised the word hope right at the beginning, actually, Dawn, and how hope and truth coexist in this moment, because, you know, there are forces that, you know, basically say it's the game's up, you know, and you know, it's not about, it's disorderly transition, go and get your house in New Zealand and, you know, put up the drawbridge. How do you respond to that kind of problem of telling the truth and remaining hopeful?
I just want to kind of say the dread word entertainment, which I think let's not forget that kind of is what we're all doing. And I think that, you know, when you think about that word, I mean, obviously we're doing loads of other things as well, but I just think that there are lots of different ways to kind of engage with people, kind of with audiences, but we sort of do need to kind of be in some way entertaining them, to kind of get them. Otherwise they won't keep coming. So I think a lot about how you know, we like Paddy was saying about how there are all these creatives kind of in this industry, and we've got all these incredible creative brains, and like we can have all these kind of ideas. And I personally think that, yeah, you could maybe think, well, there's one person in the audience and I'm trying to change this one person, but like, actually, is it as important to change the people that are making the show and the people in the organizations behind them, and, you know, and all of those people as well? And I think that that's really important. But I also think as well, for me as a writer, I'm like, well, you know, whatever it is I'm doing to them, I can do loads and loads of things, but there needs to be some reason for them to want to come, you know. And to me, I'm in two minds about the kind of like don't tell dystopian stories thing. Whilst I kind of respect that as a kind of as a thing, I do think you could tell a really entertaining dystopian story, but you could make it in this like really imaginatively sustainable way, and then people in the audience would be like, oh, there's something really interesting happened here. Like, you know, you could be doing more than one thing. But yeah, we do need to kind of get them in, like for one thing, get them in.
That's absolutely right, isn't it? And of course, there's a difference between dystopia and apocalypse, isn't there? And that they aren't sort of interchangeable. And we are in the pleasure business. So, yeah, Paddy.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think there's a couple of important things here as well, just picking up on sort of Rosie's thinking about, you know, am I doing enough? How do I affect people, whatever. And I think because climate is a global problem, it can make all of us individually feel as if we need to come up with the global solution. Whereas, of course, we're just individuals, and and we, of course, all have a limited reach. So for me, I think it's all about just making sure that everything that you can affect, you are doing. That if you're a writer, if you're a designer, if you're an architect, you're making sure that your own practice is intelligent and responsible and understands the context in which we now have to think and live and work. And I think that also is linked in some way to what I feel about what you're saying, Dawn, which is that, yes, climate is, by most measures, the most overwhelming thing we're facing, but it's not the only thing that we're facing. And life goes on, and people continue to live, and people continue to face other challenges. And this was a conversation that, in putting the Theatre Green Book together, we had a lot with writers and directors and artistic directors, that we mustn't make theatre smaller by making it only about climate. Yes, I hope there'll be wonderful shows about climate, and I hope all shows will be made responsibly, but it's going to go on being about other things. And yes, they'll go on being musicals, and they'll go on being opera, and they'll go on being comedies, and they'll go on being writing about all sorts of other social issues and aspects of social justice. It's got to be all of those things. We mustn't make theatre smaller, we need to make it bigger.
Sorry, I just wanted to
Sorry, Rosie, yeah.
thank you for that, Paddy. And I think that that's really important to remember, that the content doesn't have to be just because, like, the way that we make doesn't have, what am I trying to say? I think to me it seems more interesting to make shows in sustainable new ways, and that feels like a kind of hopeful offer, and that seems more interesting to me than making lots and lots of shows kind of about the climate crisis, I suppose, which I actually think in lots of ways can feel quite isolating, to be sat in an audience kind of watching shows about disasters. But I guess what I just wanted to clarify, that I didn't mean, I wasn't saying I felt like, oh, despairing, I don't know what to do. I guess I just am fearful of the kind of idea that any one person's individual action is what's going to transform, when in actual fact it's, I mean, it is actually the actions of a relatively small amount of people that can transform the situation we're in. But I really want to, like, talk about power, I suppose, and remember that one of the things that the reason that we're in the climate crisis is because of a unsustainable, like, unrelenting capitalist system. You know, like, that is a system of production. It's not people's own way that they live in their homes, even though that might make a small difference. So I get fearful of the idea of theatre talking to people as if the solution is them changing their individual behavior, I guess is what I was trying to say. And I think one of the important things is making people aware of their collective power. And I guess that was a kind of question to Vanessa about, is it about how people, like, what are the kind of collective actions that we can be kind of discussing, as well as the smaller way that we use materials or whatever, if that makes sense. Rather than it being despairing, I guess it's just a question of how you talk about that.
Do you want to respond to that? I fear we will need to wrap up in a second, but it'd be good to have a few sort of valedictory thoughts before we go. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to respond to Rosie's question there.
I think Rosie's right. I mean, I agree with you. It's about systems, and for me, this is a really complicated jigsaw puzzle or mosaic, and it's how all the bits fit together and how you reshape the picture from where we are to where we need to be. And to do that, actually, different people have different roles, but I think you have to see it within that whole systems piece that we started off with. So I agree, it's not about individual, small changes in your life, but if for example, the way in which we heat and build our homes and our commercial buildings changes significantly, that will have a big impact. If how we grow our food is changed, that will also have a big impact. It's all of these different chunks. It's a lot of different solutions that we will require to what is such a big challenge.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Dawn's train journey to Dusseldorf or Hamburg, wherever it was, and if you think about that, that's a really great decision. The theatre then funds it. The Writers Guild perhaps make it part of contracts. Then there is a way from the individual gesture and action to a collective response, isn't there? So let's wrap up, but I'd love to sort of just get everybody to say something before we head off into the sort of oblivion of our individual lives. Rather bleak prospect, need not be so. Dawn, would you like to just say any little concluding sort of thoughts about this session and thoughts that have come to you during it?
Yeah, I suppose one of my thoughts was just about how important it is for people to be talking to each other and sharing, and how it's gonna take a lot of connectivity, and it's going to take everybody talking to each other, making change, and also that I just really think that it can feel depressing, it can feel bleak, and it can feel like I don't know how to kind of engage with this. And I don't think that all shows should be about climate change at all. But I also think that we could see this as kind of exciting challenge. Like theatre makers are good at responding to kind of creative challenges. When they say, well, you can only have this, you can't have this, you go, okay, well, I'll try to figure out how to do it. So trying to be excited rather than scared, is my challenge.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Paddy.
Mine is the very simple one of let's get on with it and figure out some of these questions while we're doing it, rather than waiting until afterwards. We've got the tools for doing it. You know, I'm not plugging the Theatre Green Book because I was involved with it, but because hundreds of theatre makers have been involved with it. We've got the tools. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie.
That's really it for me.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess it was just very exciting to kind of hear these different perspectives, and particularly Dawn hearing about I don't know, the work that you're making and the kind of way in which like process and content feels so enmeshed, but also it was just like super exciting to have Vanessa and Paddy, but Vanessa involved in the conversation, because I feel really hungry for conversations outside of the sector, to be honest, because I often feel that I'm talking in a group of people who are going like, I think that this is maybe, I don't know, and it just feels really exciting to have yeah, a kind of expert. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And Vanessa, your thoughts?
I think picking up from all of you really, yes, we need to crack on, and there is so much that you're already doing and that you're continuing to do, and just be aware there are in every sector that is being replicated, you know, at one speed or another, and there is just lots and lots of change, which is both exhilarating and at times slightly challenging, but that's our world.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful point to end, and just to thank everybody for their brilliant contributions. Thank HighTide and Theatre Guild for this, having this conversation. I've gained an enormous amount. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.